They're aiming to target an economic growth rate of 72% by 2027, is Kenya's President William Ruto. This as the economy continues to grapple with a widening inequality and low productivity. Now, according to the Kenyan government, Ruto aims to speed up the economic growth through the implementation of the bottom-up strategy. Joining us to dissect the country's economic landscape in greater detail is Sub-Saharan African macroeconomist for Absa CIB, Ridle Markus. Ridle, always a pleasure. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
All right, this bottom-up strategy sounds very ambitious. Ridle, take us through it. What is President Ruto aiming to do and how?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously they need some kind of direction in trying to get the country to what they're hoping for is an industrialized medium or medium income country by 2030. Now, this is based on the Kenya Vision 2030, and also some of these commitments are detailed in the bottom-up economic transformation agenda. So it's basically just a plan focusing on several key areas, including the socio-economic environment, the economy, politics, or the political landscape, etc., to try and get them to elevate the growth level to such an extent that they create over 1 million jobs. I think the target is 1.2 million jobs. 1 million housing units are being built, and they've already started to work towards that. They've already, for example, President Ruto mentioned the fact that they've created a hustler fund to create credit to households and medium and small and micro enterprises. They've also started the construction of 103 housing units. So they're well on their way in trying to achieve this, but there's still a very long road ahead trying to get to these objectives.
Right. I mean, when I think of it as SMMEs, infrastructure, that does sound like a recipe for success, actually. But I'm just keen to get your thoughts on what we know about Kenya's balance sheet at current. We do know that it's been a very tricky time in terms of its debt issues. Could that be a threat to, this strategy?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's so many challenges. For example, let's just take a step back. I mean, we've seen the worst drought in 40 years in East Africa, the Horn of Africa, very recently. And we now have a very favorable weather conditions. But part of the strategy, of course, is also to increase the climate resilience. They, for example, are planning to grow 15 billion trees over the next couple of years, I think, over the next decade. And there's various projects building dams, 100 dams, for example, etc., trying to overcome some of these weather-related challenges. And that is all in the hope of again, to reach the objective of becoming a middle-income country by 2030. So there's various strategies being followed, various areas being targeted. For example, the agriculture area, as I've just talked about, the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, the digital economy, the creative economy. There's so many different areas that need to be focused on. The problem is there's so many challenges. We do know that it is not going to be an easy road to a very even sort of road going forward. We saw the difficulties that Kenya faced last year with FX shortages. We know that the global economy is probably not at its best at the moment. So there's all kinds of financing challenges that could potentially hamper or dent those kind of prospects. But at the end of the day, you need a clear strategy and you need to start working towards it. Otherwise, you're not going to create jobs and reduce poverty and grow the economy as you're hoping for.
What we are seeing, though, rather than I'm keen for you to possibly maybe confirm my theory, is that we are seeing political will, and that often helps. And also, the ability for the private sector and the public sector to work through challenges, because the only way out, I think, is through. And that often helps, for countries with strategies like this, which does seem like a strategy that at least gives a sense of direction. And that also often helps.
Absolutely. I could not have put that better. You've got a very vibrant and very strong corporate sector. The private sector in Kenya is known to be quite outside South Africa and perhaps even Nigeria, etc., is one of the strongest private sectors. So I suspect, of course, that government is going to work with the private sector towards achieving these goals. As you mentioned, you need a plan. It's going to be a long road ahead. There's many challenges coming from all kinds of directions. Some that you can control internally, others from external shocks that could potentially derail this process. But at the end of the day, Kenya has always been a high-growing economy of average, comfortably above 4%. Growth last year was above 5%. We think 5.5% this year, which is also same growth rate as the central bank. So to get to 7 and 7.2%, for example, especially if you also develop the energy sector resources that Kenya is sitting with, I think it's quite achievable. So some of the targets will be missed. I fear, for example, that the fiscal targets, they're trying to reduce a deficit to 3.2% by 27-28 fiscal year. That could potentially be a stretch, but they are under an IMF program, providing a policy anchor there, and growth is likely to be strong. So while it may not necessarily get to all these targets, I think they will probably get well, on the way in achieving most of these targets. And I think that ultimately would be acceptable.
And before I let you go, Ridle, just staying with the issue of political risk. In fact, when I was reading on President William Ruto a few weeks ago, I'd read some articles that had suggested that he would be a one-term president. And I'm wondering what that means for this plan and its possible continuity, the other politics at play within Kenya. And if that could be, something that does throw this very, I think, a solid plan off track.
Yeah, so President Ruto, as you also in your previous question alluded to, is very committed to growing Kenya and to move towards sustainable growth, for example. As to whether he's going to be a one-term president or not, difficult for me to say at this point. What I can say, of course, is what I've already said, which is there's a strong commitment from him and his administration. Is well supported by multilaterals and bilateral partners. And I think that's a huge positive for Kenya. And I think ultimately that would also help his cause in being re-elected. So I think so far he's done very well. And I remain fairly hopeful that he will continue to achieve some of these, not just the long-term objectives, but putting the economy in a more sustainable path and achieving more inclusive growth as well, with the help of multilaterals. So he's done well so far.
Well, it's a pleasure hearing from you, Ridle, and I think he's certainly rooting for Kenya this afternoon. That was Sub-Saharan African macroeconomist for Absa CIB, Ridle Markus.